Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki stood on the deck of the destroyer Hagikaze as it cut through black water toward Guadalcanal's eastern shore. Around him, 916 men of the 28th Infantry Regiment's 1st Echelon checked weapons, adjusted packs, and prepared for what their commander had promised would be a brief, decisive operation. They were some of the finest soldiers in the Imperial Japanese Army, veterans of brutal campaigns across China and Southeast Asia, men who had stormed fortified positions, survived jungle warfare, and never tasted defeat. Their training emphasized night combat, close-quarters fighting, and the spiritual superiority that Japanese doctrine insisted could overcome any material disadvantage. They had bayonets sharp enough to split bone. They had grenades. They had absolute confidence. What they didn't have was accurate intelligence. Ichiki had been told the American force numbered perhaps 2,000 men, poorly trained Marines hastily thrown onto the island with minimal supplies. Reconnaissance reports suggested weak defenses, low morale, soldiers unused to tropical conditions who would panic under a determined night assault. The colonel had studied American forces throughout the Pacific. They retreated at Wake Island eventually. They surrendered at the Philippines. They lacked the warrior spirit necessary for sustained close combat. "We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise," Ichiki told his officers during the final briefing at Truk. When staff officers suggested waiting for the regiment's 2nd Echelon, another 1,600 men still en route, Ichiki dismissed the caution with visible irritation. Delay meant giving the Americans time to fortify. Speed meant catching them unprepared, off balance, vulnerable. The landing at Taivu Point went flawlessly. 6 destroyers discharged their human cargo onto dark beaches without drawing a single shot. By 0300 hours on August 19th, the entire force had melted into the jungle, undetected, exactly as planned. Ichiki immediately dispatched reconnaissance patrols westward toward the American perimeter, while the main body established a temporary bivouac. Everything was proceeding perfectly. What Colonel Ichiki didn't know, what he couldn't have known from his intelligence briefs and tactical maps, was that he hadn't landed on a vulnerable beachhead defended by frightened amateurs. He had landed on a battlefield that had been systematically engineered for slaughter. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. 15 miles west, the Marines had spent 2 weeks transforming Guadalcanal's coastal jungle into an interlocking system of defensive positions. Every approach route had been surveyed. Every ridge and ravine registered for artillery fire. Machine gun positions had been sighted with overlapping fields of fire calculated to the yard. The sandbar at the Tenaru River, the obvious avenue of approach from the east, had been turned into a kill zone so precisely designed that a staff officer could predict casualty rates before the first shot was fired. The Americans weren't relying on courage, they were relying on mathematics. As Ichiki's men settled into the jungle, cleaning weapons and eating cold rice, they had no idea they were already inside a trap. The patrol clash with Captain Brush's Marines the next morning would trigger the mechanism. General Vandegrift would read the captured documents and know exactly what was coming. Colonel Cates would position his machine guns with mechanical precision, and when Ichiki ordered the attack, he was certain would bring easy victory. The jungle would explode with industrial violence that would redefine everything the Imperial Japanese Army thought it knew about warfare. The landing had indeed been easy. Everything after would be horror. The jungle that surrounded Henderson Field looked impenetrable to the untrained eye. A chaotic tangle of vines, palm trees, kunai grass, and ravines that seemed to favor the defender purely by accident. But the Marines who had spent 2 weeks surveying, mapping, and measuring every yard of terrain knew better. This wasn't nature anymore, it was geometry. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's engineers had done something the Japanese never anticipated. They had turned tropical chaos into a mathematical killing ground. Every ridge that offered concealment for an attacking force had been surveyed and registered as an artillery target. Every ravine that seemed to provide covered approach routes had been measured, marked, and pre-sighted by mortars. Every gap in the vegetation wide enough for men to move through had been identified and covered by interlocking machine gun fire. The Tenaru River sandbar, the obvious eastern approach to Henderson Field, had received special attention. Marines had positioned M1917A1 Browning machine guns in mutually supporting emplacements along the western bank. Each gun crew supplied with thousands of rounds of belted ammunition and clear fields of fire across the entire width of the sandbar. Behind them, 37mm anti-tank guns had been dug in and loaded with canister rounds. Artillery forward observers had registered coordinates for the riverbank, the jungle tree line, and every likely assembly area. It wasn't a defensive position. It was an ambush built by engineers who understood that firepower properly applied could eliminate the need for courage. Japanese doctrine had prepared Ichiki's men for a completely different kind of warfare. Their training emphasized aggressive night attacks to close with the enemy before superior American firepower could be brought to bear. Get close enough for bayonets and grenades where Japanese soldiers' superior fighting spirit would dominate, and the Americans would break. It had worked in China. It had worked in Malaya. It had worked everywhere Japanese forces had encountered Western troops. But those battles hadn't been fought against Marines who had spent weeks preparing terrain like engineers designing a factory floor. When Captain Charles Brush's patrol clashed with Japanese reconnaissance troops on August 19th, killing 31 soldiers and capturing detailed documents, General Vandegrift understood immediately what was coming. He read the intelligence reports showing Japanese underestimation of American strength. He saw maps indicating Ichiki's likely axis of advance. He recognized the classic pattern of a Japanese night assault. Instead of repositioning forces or falling back to tighter perimeters, Vandegrift did something that would have seemed insane by Japanese standards. He waited. He reinforced the Tenaru position with additional machine guns. He made sure artillery had fresh ammunition. He confirmed that mortar crews understood their fire missions. He positioned reserves for a counterattack. Then he let Ichiki come. Because the Marines weren't defending ground. They were operating a machine designed to convert advancing infantry into casualties at maximum efficiency. The jungle had ceased to be terrain. It had become a weapon system, one that used vegetation for concealment, ravines to channel enemy movement into predetermined kill zones, and darkness to mask the positions of guns that had already calculated every angle of fire. Japanese doctrine emphasized spirit over material. It assumed that aggressive warriors could overcome defensive firepower through shock and audacity. It had never encountered an enemy that fought like industrial engineers. That assumption was about to cost Ichiki's regiment everything. Just after midnight on August 21st, Solomon Islands scout Jacob Vuza stumbled into Marine lines, barely conscious from hours of torture. Blood poured from bayonet wounds across his throat and chest. He had one message: Japanese soldiers coming. Many soldiers. Minutes later, the jungle erupted with battle cries. Hundreds of Japanese infantrymen charged from the eastern tree line toward the sandbar. Bayonets fixed, rifles firing, grenades arcing through the darkness. They came in waves, disciplined, fearless, certain that shock and speed would carry them across the river and into the American perimeter before the Marines could organize effective resistance. They made it perhaps 30 yards. The M1917A1 Browning machine guns opened fire simultaneously, their crews having waited for the Japanese to commit fully to the assault. The sound was overwhelming. Not the sharp crack of rifle fire, but a sustained mechanical roar as 6 guns poured interlocking streams of 30-caliber rounds across the sandbar at 600 rounds per minute each. Japanese soldiers fell in clumps. Men charging shoulder to shoulder were cut down by the same burst. The heavy bullets punched through bodies and killed the men behind them. Soldiers who dropped to the sand for cover discovered there was no cover. The machine guns had been positioned to deliver grazing fire that swept the entire surface at knee height. Those who somehow made it across the sandbar ran directly into 37mm anti-tank guns, firing canister rounds. Each shell contained hundreds of steel balls that spread in a cone-shaped pattern, turning a single gun into a giant shotgun. Entire squads disintegrated. Men were shredded so thoroughly that identification became impossible. The few who survived that gauntlet encountered Marine riflemen firing M1 Garands with mechanical precision. 8 aimed shots before reloading, twice the rate of fire of Japanese Arisaka bolt-action rifles. The Americans weren't panicking. They weren't breaking. They were executing a fire plan with industrial efficiency. Behind the Marine lines, artillery forward observers called in pre-registered coordinates. Within minutes, 75mm and 105mm shells began falling on the eastern riverbank, where Japanese forces were assembling for follow-up waves. Explosions tore through packed formations. Shrapnel killed men waiting to attack. The jungle that had concealed Ichiki's approach now trapped his soldiers in a killing box with no escape routes. Colonel Ichiki, watching his regiment disintegrate, ordered repeated assaults. Wave after wave charged the sandbar. Wave after wave was annihilated. By 500 hours, the sandbar was carpeted with bodies stacked so thick that later waves had to climb over their own dead to reach American positions. Not one Japanese soldier breached the Marine defensive line. At dawn, General Vandegrift ordered a counterattack. Light tanks from the 1st Tank Battalion forded the river south of the sandbar and swept north along the beach, crushing wounded Japanese soldiers under their treads and machine-gunning survivors attempting to flee into the jungle. By 1700 hours on August 21st, the Battle of the Tanaru was over. Of the 916 men Colonel Ichiki had landed at Taivu Point 3 days earlier, 777 lay dead on the sandbar and in the surrounding jungle. Only 128 escaped, most of them wounded. 15 were captured. American casualties, 44 dead and wounded. Colonel Ichiki, confronted with the complete destruction of his regiment, burned his colors and committed suicide. The myth of Japanese invincibility in close combat had died in a single night. The survivors who staggered back to Japanese lines at Taivu Point carried reports that Imperial headquarters initially dismissed as hysteria born from shock. American machine gun fire that never stopped. Artillery that arrived within minutes of being called. Defensive positions so well coordinated that individual Marine units seemed to function as parts of a single organism. Most disturbing of all, the Americans had fought better in darkness. This violated everything Japanese military doctrine understood about Western soldiers. Night combat was supposed to belong to Japan. Aggressive tactics under cover of darkness had been a cornerstone of Imperial Army training since the Russo-Japanese War. The theory was simple: close with the enemy when visibility drops, negate their firepower advantage, force them into close-quarters combat, where Japanese fighting spirit and bayonet training would dominate. It had worked against Chinese forces who broke and fled when Japanese infantry attacked at night. It had worked against British troops in Malaya, who retreated from aggressive nocturnal assaults. Western soldiers, Japanese planners believed, became disoriented in darkness, fired blindly, panicked when they couldn't see their enemy. The Marines at the Tanaru had done the opposite. They had waited in absolute silence until the Japanese were fully committed to the attack. They had held fire until targets were impossible to miss. Then they had unleashed coordinated volleys that suggested pre-planned fire zones rather than panicked defensive shooting. Their machine guns never fired wildly. Each burst was controlled, aimed, lethal. When Japanese soldiers sought cover in the darkness, American mortars found them with uncanny precision. Most unnerving, the Marines seemed to know exactly where Japanese forces were concentrating even in pitch blackness. Forward observers were calling artillery strikes on assembly areas that should have been invisible. Machine gun crews were traversing their weapons to catch Japanese soldiers moving through jungle that Americans couldn't possibly see into. What the Japanese didn't understand was that the Marines had turned darkness into an advantage through systematic preparation rather than individual night-fighting skills. Every approach route had been studied in daylight and marked. Every depression that might offer cover had been registered as a target. Gun crews had practiced traversing their weapons along predetermined azimuths so they could sweep kill zones without visual confirmation. The Americans weren't seeing in the dark. They had memorized the battlefield so thoroughly that vision became unnecessary. Lieutenant Jiro Nakagawa, one of the few officers to survive the Tanaru assault, wrote in his diary, "We were told Americans fear the night. We were told they cannot fight without seeing their enemy. Everything we were told was lies. They do not fear darkness. They have made it their weapon." Even more disturbing were reports of American discipline under pressure. Japanese doctrine assumed that enemy troops subjected to repeated attacks would gradually lose cohesion, that fear and exhaustion would erode unit effectiveness even if individual assaults failed. The opposite had happened at the Tanaru. The Marines had grown calmer as the night progressed, their fire more controlled, their responses more efficient. They weren't warriors relying on courage to overcome fear. They were technicians executing a mechanical process. By dawn on August 22nd, as Japanese commanders studied casualty reports showing nearly 90% losses for Ichiki's regiment, a horrifying realization was beginning to crystallize. American forces didn't fight the way Japanese intelligence had predicted. They didn't break under night attacks. They didn't panic when outnumbered. They functioned as a system, and systems don't feel fear. September 12, 1942, a narrow coral ridge south of Henderson Field that Marines called Edson's Ridge, soon to be known simply as Bloody Ridge. If Tanaru had been a warning, this would be confirmation. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi had landed 6,200 troops on Guadalcanal with explicit orders to succeed where Ichiki had failed. But Kawaguchi was no impulsive instructor. He was an experienced division commander who had studied the Tanaru disaster carefully. He would not repeat Ichiki's mistakes. His forces would attack from multiple directions simultaneously. They would concentrate overwhelming numbers against a single point. They would attack at night, yes, but with proper reconnaissance, artillery support, and numerical superiority that would grind through American defenses through sheer mass. He chose to strike the ridge held by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion, approximately 840 Marines defending a position that controlled the southern approach to Henderson Field. What Kawaguchi didn't know was that he was attacking the most elite infantry the United States Marine Corps could field. Commanded by an officer who understood defensive warfare with mathematical precision. The assault began just after nightfall. Thousands of Japanese infantry surged up the ridge's slopes, screaming battle cries, firing rifles, hurling grenades. They came in human waves designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers. Initial attacks pushed the Marine forward positions back, gaining ground, creating the illusion of momentum. Then they hit the main defensive line. Edson had positioned his Marines in depth, each position supporting the others. Machine guns sighted to create interlocking fire across every approach. When Japanese forces concentrated to break through one section, mortars immediately walked across that area with precision that suggested the coordinates had been registered days earlier, because they had. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone commanded a machine gun section on the ridge's most critical point. When the Japanese assault concentrated against his position, 2 of his gun crews were killed outright. Basilone, rather than withdrawing, moved between the guns himself, firing one until the barrel glowed red, switching to the second while the first cooled, maintaining continuous fire that held an entire sector alone. For hours, he fired, reloaded, cleared jammed weapons, directed ammunition bearers, and killed Japanese soldiers by the dozens. When ammunition ran low, he fought through enemy-held ground to retrieve more, carrying belts of .30 caliber rounds while Japanese infantry fired at him from meters away. The 81mm mortar crews supporting the ridge fired danger-close missions, dropping high-explosive shells within 50 yards of Marine positions because Edson trusted his men to hold steady, while steel fragments shredded Japanese soldiers climbing the slope. The attack continued through the night, wave after wave. The Japanese believed that sustained pressure would eventually break American cohesion. Instead, the Marines fought with mechanical consistency, controlled fire, disciplined ammunition management, coordinated responses to every penetration attempt. At dawn on September 14th, the ridge remained in American hands. Japanese casualties, 850 dead on the slopes and in the jungle approaches. Marine casualties, 104 dead and wounded. Kawaguchi's survivors staggered back through the jungle, shattered not just by defeat, but by the realization that numbers meant nothing against firepower properly applied. Japanese soldiers had charged American positions with suicidal courage, and courage had been systematically converted into corpses by Marines who fought like machines built for killing. The myth hadn't just cracked, it had died completely. In the aftermath of Bloody Ridge, Japanese officers began writing reports that revealed a profound cognitive dissonance. They described American soldiers as simultaneously cowardly and devastatingly effective, men who relied on machines rather than fighting spirit, yet somehow won every engagement. The confusion was understandable. Japanese military doctrine had been built on a foundation of spiritual superiority. The Senjin-kun military code emphasized that willpower could overcome material disadvantages, that aggressive offensive action trumped defensive firepower, that the warrior's spirit was Japan's ultimate weapon. Soldiers were taught that death in battle was the highest honor, that retreat was unthinkable, that courage in close combat would always defeat enemies who hid behind technology. This philosophy had produced spectacular victories across Asia. It had worked against Chinese forces whose equipment and training couldn't match Japanese aggression. It had worked against British and Dutch colonial troops whose industrial advantages were negated by Japan's rapid, violent assaults. But on Guadalcanal, spirit was colliding with system, and system was winning. The Americans fought war like an engineering problem. Their infantry didn't rely on individual heroism, but on coordinated firepower. A Marine rifle company functioned as a weapons platform. M1 Garand rifles providing base fire, Browning automatic rifles suppressing enemy positions, .30 caliber machine guns delivering sustained area fire, 60mm mortars providing immediate indirect support, with 81mm mortars and artillery on call within minutes. Japanese infantry tactics emphasized getting close enough to negate this firepower advantage. But the Marines had developed defense-in-depth techniques specifically designed to prevent penetration. Outposts detected attacks early. Interlocking fields of fire eliminated gaps. Pre-registered artillery coordinates allowed instant response to any breakthrough attempt. Even when Japanese soldiers reached American positions, they encountered coordinated small unit tactics rather than individual combatants. Fire teams supporting each other. Automatic weapons covering riflemen. Everyone functioning as components in a larger system. Behind the front lines, the contrast became even more stark. American logistics treated warfare as a supply chain problem. Engineers built roads. Supply officers calculated ammunition expenditure rates. Medical corpsmen provided forward trauma care that saved wounded Marines who would have died in any previous war. The Cactus Air Force operated on maintenance schedules that kept aircraft flying despite minimal facilities. Artillery batteries fired thousands of rounds because supply ships brought thousands more. Japanese forces relied on fighting spirit to compensate for logistical weakness. Soldiers were expected to endure hunger, disease, and ammunition shortages through sheer willpower. Officers treated supply problems as tests of character rather than operational crises. When rations ran short, troops were told to tighten their belts and remember their duty to the emperor. One system depended on courage overcoming hardship. The other system eliminated hardship through industrial capacity. Major Nishino Mitsuo, a battalion commander who survived the September battles, wrote with bitter clarity, "The Americans do not fight with warrior spirit. They fight with arithmetic. They calculate ammunition, coordinates, fields of fire, supply rates. We attack with courage. They respond with mathematics. And mathematics wins." The realization was spreading through Japanese ranks. This wasn't a war where spirit mattered. This was a war of systems. And Japan's system was already collapsing. By October 1942, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were dying faster from hunger than from bullets. The Tokyo Express, the fast destroyer runs that brought troops under cover of darkness, had successfully landed thousands of reinforcements. But destroyers optimized for speed couldn't carry the tons of food, medicine, and ammunition those troops needed to fight. The ships arrived, unloaded soldiers, and departed before dawn when American aircraft from Henderson Field would turn the surrounding waters into a killing ground. Men arrived. Supplies didn't. Japanese soldiers who had landed in August with standard rations found those rations exhausted by September. The rice ran out first, then the canned goods, then the emergency reserves. By October, men were eating grass, tree bark, and anything they could scavenge from the jungle. Hunger became a constant, gnawing presence that overshadowed fear of American firepower. Private Okumura Sadao wrote in his diary, "Today I ate leaves and roots. My stomach cramps constantly. 3 men in my squad too weak to stand. We have ammunition but no strength to carry it. What good are bullets when you cannot lift your rifle?" The death rate told the story. Approximately 50 Japanese soldiers were dying every day, not from combat, but from starvation, malaria, dysentery, and tropical diseases that ravaged bodies already weakened by malnutrition. Men wasted away until their ribs protruded like bamboo frames. Tropical ulcers ate through flesh to the bone. Malaria burned through entire companies, leaving survivors shaking with fever, unable to maintain their positions. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Quinine for malaria had run out in September. Bandages were improvised from torn uniforms. Surgery meant screaming soldiers held down, while medics amputated infected limbs with whatever blades were available. The wounded often died not from their injuries, but from infections that antibiotics could have prevented. If Japan had antibiotics to spare for Guadalcanal, it wasn't just individual suffering. Starvation was destroying combat effectiveness at every level. Infantry companies that had landed at battalion strength now fielded perhaps 100 effectives. The rest dead, hospitalized, or too weak to fight. Soldiers assigned to night attacks often couldn't complete the approach march because malnourished bodies couldn't sustain the physical effort of moving through jungle terrain. Men ordered to dig defensive positions lacked the strength to work entrenching tools. Officers watched their commands disintegrate not through cowardice, but through biological collapse. Captain Suzuki Hajime reported that his company of 180 men now had 43 capable of combat duty. The others were technically alive but functionally useless, lying in makeshift shelters, too weak to stand, waiting to die. The psychological impact compounded the physical devastation. Japanese soldiers had been taught that willpower could overcome any hardship, that spiritual strength mattered more than material comfort. But no amount of fighting spirit could make a starving body function. Men who had charged machine guns without hesitation found themselves unable to walk 20 meters. Warriors reduced to skeletal invalids, their rifles too heavy to lift, their bodies consuming themselves to stay alive. Meanwhile, 15 miles away, Marines were eating hot meals delivered by supply ships that arrived in broad daylight under the protection of Henderson Field's aircraft. The Americans weren't just winning firefights. They were watching their enemy starve to death. The contrast became impossible to ignore. While Japanese soldiers scraped bark from trees and boiled grass into unpalatable soup, American supply ships unloaded crates of sea rations, canned fruit, coffee, chocolate bars, and cigarettes. While Japanese wounded died from infected wounds in jungle shelters, Marine corpsmen administered sulfa drugs, morphine, plasma transfusions, and antibiotics. While Japanese artillery rationed shells to perhaps 10 rounds per day, American batteries fired hundreds, sometimes thousands, in coordinated bombardments that turned jungle into moonscape. The disparity wasn't subtle. It was overwhelming, systematic, and relentless. Henderson Field had become the center of an industrial logistics operation that treated war as a manufacturing process requiring continuous material input. Transport aircraft landed daily carrying ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts, and mail from home. Supply ships arrived under air cover, unloading tons of everything the Marines needed to sustain operations. Seabees, Navy construction battalions, operated heavy equipment to build roads, expand the airfield, construct warehouses, and install fuel storage facilities. Japanese observers watching from the jungle ridges could see American engineering transforming Guadalcanal into a fortified base. Bulldozers carved roads through terrain that Japanese infantry struggled to traverse on foot. Trucks moved supplies that would have required hundreds of Japanese porters. Generators powered lights that turned night into day. The Americans were building infrastructure while Japanese forces were literally starving in the jungle a few miles away. The Cactus Air Force operated with a maintenance capability that seemed incomprehensible to Japanese pilots. American aircraft that were damaged in combat returned to Henderson Field, where mechanics repaired them using spare parts flown in from rear bases. But engine changes that would have grounded a Japanese aircraft permanently were completed overnight. Even planes shot full of holes were patched, rebuilt, and returned to service. Japanese aircraft that sustained damage were often abandoned. There were no spare parts, no mechanics with proper tools, no supply chain to support sustained operations. Artillery illustrated the disparity most clearly. American gun batteries fired pre-planned barrages using fire direction centers that calculated coordinates with mathematical precision. Forward observers called in strikes using radio communications that connected them instantly to battery commanders. Ammunition was so plentiful that batteries could fire harassment missions throughout the night just to deny Japanese forces rest. Japanese artillery, when it functioned at all, rationed ammunition so severely that guns might fire only during major attacks. Radio equipment was scarce and unreliable. Observation was primitive. Even when Japanese gunners acquired targets, they often lacked shells to engage them. Lieutenant Kobayashi Masao, an artillery officer, wrote with devastating clarity, "We count our remaining shells daily. The Americans fire more rounds in an hour than we have for the entire month. This is not war. This is industrial murder." The psychological impact of this material imbalance was crushing. Japanese soldiers weren't just fighting an enemy. They were fighting an enemy whose resources appeared infinite. Every American defensive position seemed to have unlimited ammunition. Every attack encountered fresh reinforcements. Every Japanese success was reversed by firepower so abundant it seemed wasteful. Sergeant Watanabe Isamu captured the growing despair. "We fight with courage and receive nothing. They fight with machines and receive everything. How do we defeat an enemy who can waste more ammunition in one day than our entire army possesses?" The answer, increasingly obvious to Japanese survivors, was simple and terrible. They couldn't. October 23, 1942, Imperial General Headquarters ordered one final all-or-nothing assault to recapture Henderson Field. Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama commanded 7,000 troops of the 2nd Division's Sendai Regiment, some of the finest infantry Japan could field. The plan was elaborate. A multi-pronged night attack that would overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers and coordinated pressure. Major General Yumio Nasu would lead the southern thrust. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, seeking redemption after Bloody Ridge, would attack from the east. It would be Japan's largest ground offensive of the Pacific War to date. It would also be their most catastrophic defeat. The approach march alone shattered Japanese forces before the battle began. Maruyama's troops spent days hacking through nearly impenetrable jungle south of the marine perimeter, dragging artillery pieces through ravines and over ridges that maps had marked as passable terrain. Men already weakened by malnutrition collapsed on the trail. Artillery had to be abandoned when crews lacked the strength to manhandle guns through the jungle. Officers pushed their commands forward on willpower alone, promising that victory at Henderson Field would end their suffering. The attack finally came on the night of October 24th, fragmented, uncoordinated, and hours behind schedule. Nasu's forces hit the Marine defensive line south of Henderson Field with suicidal determination. Thousands of Japanese infantry charged through jungle so thick that units lost contact with each other within minutes. They emerged from the tree line in waves, screaming battle cries, firing rifles, hurling grenades, running directly into Marine positions that had been reinforced, fortified, and registered for supporting fires after the lessons of Bloody Ridge. The M1917A1 Browning machine guns opened fire. Artillery shells fell on pre-registered coordinates. Mortars walked across Japanese assembly areas with precision that suggested the Marines had known exactly where the attack would come from, because intelligence officers had predicted it days earlier. Japanese soldiers fought with desperate courage. They overran isolated positions. They penetrated the Marine defensive line in several places. They came within 1,000 yards of Henderson Field's runways, closer than any Japanese force had reached since the campaign began. And then American firepower crushed them. Naval gunfire from offshore destroyers illuminated the jungle with star shells and poured 5-inch rounds into Japanese rear areas. Artillery batteries fired continuously, some guns becoming so hot that crews had to pour water on the barrels between fire missions. The 164th Infantry Regiment, U.S. Army soldiers who had just landed as reinforcements, fed into the line and held positions with the disciplined fire that came from units that had ammunition to spare. By dawn on October 26th, the offensive had collapsed completely. General Nasu was dead, killed leading a charge that gained perhaps 100 yards before being annihilated. Kawaguchi's eastern attack had never materialized. His starving troops couldn't even reach their assault positions. The jungle south of Henderson Field was carpeted with Japanese bodies, many killed so close to Marine positions that their corpses would rot there for weeks, the stench marking the high water mark of Japan's Guadalcanal offensive. Casualties told the story. Approximately 2,000 Japanese dead in 48 hours. American losses, roughly 200. Something broke in the surviving Japanese troops after the October offensive. Not just formations, morale itself. Soldiers who had believed absolutely in eventual victory now understood they were trapped on an island where American firepower and logistics would grind them down regardless of courage. Officers who had promised that fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantage now had no answer for men dying of starvation while ammunition piled up unused because there weren't enough healthy soldiers to fire it. Private Wada Kiyoshi wrote simply, "We have lost. They will never tell us this, but we know." The strategic calculus of Guadalcanal could be reduced to a simple equation. Japan owned the night, America owned the day, and daylight lasted longer. The Cactus Air Force, a constantly rotating collection of Marine, Navy, and Army Air Force squadrons operating from Henderson Field, had established absolute air superiority over the island and surrounding waters during daylight hours. F-4F Wildcat fighters patrolled in relays. SBD Dauntless dive bombers and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers sat on the runway, fueled and armed, ready to launch within minutes of enemy ship sightings. Any Japanese vessel that ventured within 200 miles of Guadalcanal during daylight risked immediate attack. This single fact dictated everything. Japanese supply convoys that could have brought the tons of food, ammunition, and medicine necessary to sustain their forces simply couldn't survive the daylight run to Guadalcanal. Slow-moving cargo ships loaded with supplies were perfect targets for American dive bombers. The few transport runs attempted in August and September had ended with ships burning and sinking, their precious cargoes lost. So Japan adapted with the Tokyo Express, fast destroyer runs under cover of darkness. Destroyers were warships, not cargo vessels. They prioritized speed and combat capability over carrying capacity. A destroyer that could outrun American aircraft by departing before dawn could carry perhaps 200 troops and a few tons of supplies. A proper cargo ship could carry 2,000 tons of food, ammunition, and equipment. Japan was feeding an army with what amounted to overnight courier service. The mathematics were brutal. Each Tokyo Express run delivered hundreds of fresh troops to Guadalcanal, men who arrived with the rifles they carried and perhaps 3 days of rations. Meanwhile, those same men required continuous supply: food, ammunition, medical supplies, replacement weapons, and all the logistical support that sustained military operations. The equation never balanced. By November, Japan had successfully landed more than 20,000 troops on Guadalcanal. But those 20,000 men were consuming supplies faster than destroyer runs could deliver them. American aircraft sank destroyers that tried to carry extra cargo. Submarines torpedoed any vessel slow enough to haul meaningful quantities of food. Even when Tokyo Express runs succeeded, they delivered perhaps 10% of what those troops actually needed. Japanese soldiers understood the terrible irony. Reinforcements were arriving to share the starvation. Meanwhile, American supply operations functioned in broad daylight with almost casual efficiency. Cargo ships escorted by destroyers and covered by Henderson Field aircraft unloaded at Lunga Point throughout the day. Transport planes landed continuously. Liberty ships brought everything from ammunition to construction equipment to Thanksgiving turkeys. The Marines weren't just supplied, they were oversupplied. Warehouses at Lunga Point held reserve stocks. Artillery batteries fired freely because fresh ammunition arrived weekly. The Cactus Air Force operated at sortie rates that consumed fuel and ordnance faster than Japanese forces could comprehend. And supply ships simply brought more. Corporal Tanaka Hiroshi, captured in November, described his shock when taken to the American logistics area. "I saw warehouses full of food, mountains of ammunition crates, fuel drums stacked higher than houses. We were told Americans were struggling, barely holding on. But they have more supplies in one warehouse than our entire army received in 3 months." The daylight advantage had created an insurmountable logistical asymmetry. American forces fought a well-supplied war of attrition. Japanese forces fought while starving. And every sunrise reinforced which side would win. December 31st, 1942, our Imperial General Headquarters issued an order that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier: evacuate Guadalcanal. The decision was dressed in euphemistic language: strategic repositioning, consolidation of defensive lines, transfer of forces to more critical sectors. But every officer who read the directive understood its true meaning. Japan was abandoning the first ground campaign, where American forces had not merely held defensive positions but systematically destroyed attacking Japanese armies. It was defeat, absolute, undeniable defeat. Planning the evacuation required confronting the catastrophic reality of what Guadalcanal had become. Intelligence estimated that approximately 10,000 to 12,000 Japanese troops remained alive on the island, barely 1/3 of the total forces that had been committed. The rest were dead, most from starvation and disease rather than combat. Those who survived were barely recognizable as soldiers. Medical officers reported that the average Japanese infantryman on Guadalcanal weighed perhaps 90 pounds, skeletal frames covered in tropical ulcers, ravaged by malaria, too weak to march without assistance. Many couldn't walk at all. Units that had landed at regimental strength now fielded perhaps 200 effectives. The rest were living corpses, waiting for death. The evacuation itself was a masterpiece of Japanese naval operations. The one aspect of the campaign where Japan's military excellence still functioned. Destroyers of the Tokyo Express, now running in reverse, would conduct 3 nighttime extraction missions in early February 1943. The operation required absolute secrecy. American forces had to believe Japanese troops were reinforcing, not retreating. The deception worked. On the nights of February 1st, 4th, and 7th, Japanese destroyers raced to Cape Esperance under cover of darkness, embarked as many troops as possible, and departed before dawn, brought American aircraft. Soldiers too weak to walk were carried to the beaches by comrades who were themselves starving. Equipment was abandoned. Artillery was spiked and left behind. Supplies that Japan had sacrificed men to deliver were destroyed to prevent American capture. The final count: 10,052 survivors evacuated. American forces didn't realize what had happened until Japanese resistance simply ceased. Patrols advancing into areas that should have been defended found abandoned positions, equipment scattered in the jungle, and mass graves where Japanese soldiers had buried their own dead. On February 9, 1943, Major General Alexander Patch, who had replaced General Vandegrift in December 2, sent a message to Admiral Halsey. "Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal." The campaign was over. American casualties: approximately 7,100 dead and wounded, the majority from disease. Japanese casualties: approximately 19,000 dead, 2/3 from starvation and disease. More significantly, Japan had lost something that couldn't be measured in casualty statistics: the aura of invincibility. Since 1937, Japanese ground forces had known only victory. They had swept across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum. The idea that Japan could lose a sustained ground campaign had been literally unthinkable. Guadalcanal made it fact. For Japanese planners, the implications were devastating. If American firepower, logistics, and industrial capacity could destroy a Japanese army on a single jungle island, what would happen when those same advantages were applied across the Pacific? For American strategists, Guadalcanal provided a template. Isolate Japanese forces, establish air superiority, leverage logistical advantages, and let systemic superiority grind down enemies who relied on courage to overcome material weakness. The battle had proven that fighting spirit couldn't defeat factories, and America had all the factories. In the months following the evacuation, Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal wrote reports, diary entries, and after-action analyses that revealed a profound shift in understanding. The tone was strikingly different from the confident assessments that had preceded the campaign. They had encountered something unprecedented, an enemy that fought war as an industrial process rather than a test of martial virtue. Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, a staff officer who visited Guadalcanal during the October offensive, wrote with unusual candor, "The American soldier is not individually superior. He does not possess exceptional fighting spirit. But he is a component in a machine that we cannot match. Their firepower is not emotional. It is mathematical. They calculate fields of fire, ammunition expenditure rates, logistical requirements, casualty ratios. We attack with courage. They respond with systems." The diary of Lieutenant Nakagawa Jiro, recovered from his body after he died of starvation in January 1943, captured the psychological impact. "We were told Americans were soft, that they would break under pressure, that our warrior spirit would overcome their machines. Every piece of this was lies. They are not soft, they are methodical. They did not break, they grew stronger. Their machines did not fail, they multiplied. We are dying not because Americans are better warriors, but because they have more of everything and waste nothing." Japanese military doctrine had been built on assumptions that Guadalcanal systematically demolished. Assumption: night attacks negate American firepower advantages. Reality: Americans turned darkness into a weapon through preparation, pre-registered fires, and defensive systems that didn't require visibility to function. Assumption: Japanese soldiers' superior fighting spirit compensates for material disadvantages. Reality: courage cannot overcome starvation. Fighting spirit cannot deflect machine gun fire. Willpower cannot manufacture ammunition. Assumption: decisive offensive action will break American morale. Reality: American forces grew more effective under sustained pressure, their defensive systems optimized through experience, while Japanese forces were ground down by attrition. Assumption: Japan's naval superiority allows control of the battlefield. Reality: aircraft operating from a single captured airfield negated Japanese naval advantages during daylight hours, and daylight lasted longer than darkness. The strategic implications were devastating. If Japan couldn't defeat one Marine division on a single jungle island despite committing nearly 30,000 troops, how could they defend the thousands of islands stretching across the Pacific? If American industrial capacity could sustain operations at Guadalcanal while simultaneously building up forces for future offensives, how could Japan, already resource-starved, compete in a prolonged war? Major Horie Yoshitaka, who served on Guadalcanal and survived to write his memoirs, concluded, "We learned that America does not fight battles. They solve logistical equations. Every American position we attacked had more ammunition than we carried in our entire campaign. Their wounded received medical care we couldn't imagine. Their soldiers ate while ours starved. This wasn't warfare as we understood it. This was industrial capacity applied to killing, and we had no answer. Perhaps most revealing was a captured Japanese intelligence assessment from early 1943 that circulated among senior officers. Guadalcanal has demonstrated that the United States possesses firepower advantages we cannot overcome, logistical capabilities we cannot match, and industrial depth we cannot sustain combat against. Continued offensive operations will result in the systematic destruction of the Imperial Army. The terror that Japanese soldiers felt at Tenaru, at Bloody Ridge, at Henderson Field wasn't fear of American warriors. It was the dawning realization that they were fighting a system that couldn't be defeated with courage, a machine that converted industrial capacity into firepower, logistics into dominance, and Japanese bravery into corpses stacked on jungle ridges. Private Okumura Sadao, who survived evacuation only to die at Tarawa 9 months later, wrote in his final diary entry from Guadalcanal, "The Americans did not beat us. Their factories did. We cannot win this war." He was right. Guadalcanal had proven it.